if we are going to make an investment in a company that has exposure to conflict and weapons, what does a responsible investment kind of look like?
Hello, and welcome to The Greener Way. I'm Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media here at FS Sustainability. Thank you for joining us. Now, we've recently covered big themes like AI and climate change. But today, we're turning to an area that's becoming increasingly relevant and at times controversial for investors, and that is defense investing. Joining me is Jess Cairns, Head of Responsible Investment at Alphinity, to talk about new developments in this sector and what it means for investors. Jess, great to have you back. We had you, I think, earlier last year.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for having me.
I know that this is, as I've pointed out, at times controversial, but truly it's quite important for investors because the returns are quite varied. You might go with a stock that returns 50% over the year compared with the average super fund returns of 12%. So tell me, did this come through your radar like just this year, or has this been an issue like, I don't know, for the last couple of years?
Yeah, so, obviously defense is not a new topic. This is something that's been around for a long time. And I do just want to sort of emphasize before we start that Alphinity does have exclusions in place that have been in place for a number of years around controversial weapons, and then additional exclusions for our sustainable funds around nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. But, the story kind of goes in 2024, actually. So early in 2024, one of our portfolio managers who covers industrials in the global equities business recognised, I guess, as you point out, that growth prospect in defence, and recognising that a number of, international governments, as well as the Australian government, the EU was starting to kind of make noise around changing some of its boundaries on different weapons categorisation. And he sort of made the observation that, although we have exclusions and we have had those, in practice, it's not really something that we've had to apply. Honestly, it's not a sector that we had invested in a lot. We would have had some indirect exposures across our portfolio, but not really companies that were controversial, not really companies that were involved in, active conflict. And so, yes, recognizing that, basically what we did is, starting in early 2024, started a review of trying to firstly better understand the nature of weapons exposures throughout different sectors. Trying to understand whether we as investors would be able to get clarity on those exposures, so either through a company's disclosure or through conversations with them. And lastly, where as responsible investors, we should sort of be drawing the line around those hard exclusions and how we should be considering enhanced due diligence, I guess, where we are willing to invest in companies. So essentially what we set out to do was we ran a survey with over 60 industrial companies. So we essentially just sent them a questionnaire. It took about 12 months, but we got a 75% response rate back on that, which we were really happy with.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. And, I think what we were very pleased with actually is that a lot of the companies that do have a lot of exposure and quite direct exposure, so for example, Safran, so the French business that works on nuclear weapons, as well as like BAE Systems, so one of the sort of, Britain primes, defence primes. Those types of companies were very willing to tell us their, the type of and the nature of that exposure, and they have like statements on their website. Where we found it got quite murky was once you sort of move into companies that might be providing like a sensor or something that, can go into all different types of equipment, including weapons, or something like, turbines that might go into, fighter jets, and those fighter jets can carry, obviously a weapon on them. Like, how do we sort of think about those? So that's where it sort of started to get a little bit more murky, and where we then spent time in really shaping up our sort of broader framework for applying our exclusion policy.
Now, are you talking about, I'm hearing this now more often than not, dual-use technologies where a company is really using it for healthcare purposes, but suddenly they've won a major government contract. So was that something that was discussed, I guess, and how you've enhanced your framework?
Yes, excellent question. And what we did do as well, like as part of the initial sort of review at looking at companies, was also did a scan across the investor base, global investor bases that have, public policies, as well as like our, institutional investors in Australia and in Europe and in the US. And a lot of investors at the time at least, used that type of language, single use and dual use classifications. And a lot of investors would draw the kind of boundary on that hard exclusion. So for instance, if you have a 10% exclusion for conventional weapons, a lot of investors would sort of draw that boundary on the final manufacturer of the weapon plus the like single-use components that might be going in, which are like dedicated and designed for that application. And then they would say dual use might be outside the boundary or might have additional, a different requirement. So we, in our initial draft of our sort of internal implementation sort of framework, use that type of language. And after our consultation with the companies, we actually decided against using that. And the reason is because if we want to have a clear policy position on what we will and will not invest in, and we want to make sure that that is clear for our investors, we have to make sure that we can implement that with 100% certainty. And I believe that that differentiation between what is dual use and what is single use is actually really, really hard to delineate. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that there's a lot of components which are, very small, might be considered generic in nature, but ultimately are always going to be designed for their end purpose. So does that make it single use or does that make it dual use? Like, for example, if you have a bolt and the bolt is going into like a weapons launching system, that bolt will obviously be, tailored for where it's going to end up, in the system. And that system is specifically designed for a weapon. So would you put that but it's essentially just a bolt. It could be tweaked and it could be used for, any number of things. And I think that that line is actually, in practice, is quite hard to draw. And I started personally to get a little bit uncomfortable in how we would be able to apply that type of structure. So what we ended up doing is reasonably simplistic, and this has been clarified in all of our external disclosures as well, is that we have drawn the sort of hard boundary around the final manufacture of the weapon. So the final sort of production of the weapon. But what we have also done is drawn like more of an upper limit for that indirect exposure and really made sure that with an enhanced due diligence process that we're able to look more closely at companies where they do have those indirect exposures rather than, trying to sort of do that, like exclusion type boundary. If that makes sense.
See, that's why you're the head of responsible investment, Jess. I mean, someone has to go through this and go, do these definitions make sense?
Yeah, can we apply them?
In a simplistic world, yes, but when you're investing, maybe not.
Yeah.
So, all right. Now, forgive me for my lack of knowledge around this, but we've talked about weapons and a lot of investors and maybe even some of our listeners who are new to the world of sustainability investing will think, well, what is the typical weapons policy? So we've talked about dual use, single use.
Yeah.
But how would you explain that to someone who's just started in the industry?
Yeah. Look, it is actually very varied across, again, if you look at a range of different investors, like institutional and fund managers, policies, it is very varied actually on, I think you mentioned before we started on, controversial weapons, that sort of universal exclusion and like a 0% revenue threshold for controversial weapons is pretty standardized across the industry.
Standard, yes.
But treatment of sort of, nuclear weapons, and again, the EU has obviously removed nuclear weapons from its sort of prohibited weapons bucket. So that has changed the kind of narrative a little bit around that. But conventional weapons also looks quite different. I would say in terms of sort of good practice and what we have tried to do is to make it clear where our hard line is. So, and make that very clear to, as I say, our external stakeholders as well as internally, and make sure that we can actually implement that with a really high degree of certainty. Secondly is to draw some kind of parameters for ourselves on like, if we are going to make an investment in a company that has exposure to conflict and weapons, what does a responsible investment kind of look like for that? So one thing that we have done that I think was quite practical and I think has helped us quite a bit in sort of navigating some of the complexity is drawn like a sort of risk classification structure for ourselves. So, you can think about weapons categories from like a degree of harm. There's kind of a few different ways to think about it. A degree of harm. So, obviously, nuclear or controversial weapons would be, right at that top end in the red from a mass harm sort of perspective. And then we sort of have weapons manufacturer, we have defense services. So things like technology services, companies like Palantir kind of fall into that bucket. You have your dual use industrial. So, broad components, like we have companies like Howmet and Amphenol that sort of fit in that bucket. And then you have sort of just broad services, all again, which is just broad, Microsoft or something like that, where it's not defense specific, but it's just a broad service. And sort of framing it up with that sort of, risk classification helps us to think about what the different implications are related to those different types of services and what the different sort of, risk assessment, might look like for Alphinity. And we have done quite a bit of work actually in sort of building out what that due diligence assessment looks like, which I can cover as well if it's worthwhile.
What investors want is just some clarity that the world has changed since 2022. Suddenly, after the invasion of Ukraine, we now have, NATO thinking of increasing their defense spending.
Yes.
It just feels like, okay, so do we have to look at our definition? Which leads me to my next question. We talked about the risks, we've talked about the sector growing, and now it's about balancing the risk and return.
Yes.
Now let's talk about the opportunities, or if you like, so how are you investing given those definitions and the framework you have in place?
Yeah, so I think a really sort of important message I think to convey as part of this as well is like, we started this work, a long time ago, and it did take us quite a while to really bed down what that implementation framework should look like for us and what that looks like across our different funds. But in doing that nice and early and doing that in a really sort of considered way where like all of the PMs were brought along, our founders were involved, it has enabled us to make decisions and to make investments. And I would argue without maybe having done that work nice and early, a lot of people, might have still just been sort of a little bit uncomfortable and thought, well,
still figuring it out.
Yeah, is this the right thing to do? Is it not the right thing to do? I'm not sure. And then, potentially sacrificing some of those, good returns that obviously exist within this sector. So, yes, we have actually been able to make some investments. And to give you an example, we made an investment in a company called Howmet, which does like casters and casings in the industrial sector. And I think it's about 5% or so of their products do go into weapons, but it is quite indirect. And those products would be considered in that broad dual use bucket. So that is a company that we actually made an investment in our Global Sustainable Equity Fund as well. And, we have, a whole process that kind of sits around decisions on the sustainable fund, but obviously managing that indirect. And, the thing that we really wanted to get comfortable with for a company like Howmet is understanding their distribution and end markets. Does the company have throughsight into where their products end up? What sort of governments are they working with? How are they complying with like sanctions laws? Are they coming through with any material controversies from a conflict zone perspective? Would we be concerned around, like misuse or any human rights abuses? And, for all of that with something like Howmet, the answer was no to all of those questions. We were very comfortable, and it's been a really good investment. It's been in the fund for quite some time now. So that's just one example, but there has been a number of examples where we have then sort of made that investment. I think at this point, we haven't gone down the path of investing in a sort of pure weapons manufacturer. We have looked at companies like BAE Systems and Safran. The portfolio management team haven't, made the decision to make those investments. But, in theory, according to our framework, we would be able to do that for our core funds.
So Jess, now we know about the risk, the returns, but can you give me an example of like a hard decision you've had to make or the team had to make where a company that you thought was promising stayed within the bucket of the definitions that you have, somehow breached it didn't do what they promised, or they didn't inform you of a significant change in their revenue profile?
Yeah, no, we don't have any examples of that yet, only because the time frame has been quite short, but we have had to make some really difficult decisions. And I think like one of the things that's sort of interesting in our engagement with our investors is a lot of the kind of specifics around, weapons exposure and like whereabouts that exposure sits. Most of our investors are fairly comfortable with that as long as we can show that we've done our due diligence and done our work. I think where it becomes a lot more challenging is where you have companies with specific exposure to conflict zones. And, particularly in the Middle East at the moment is obviously where that's an issue. So, an example of that is a company called Caterpillar. So Cat, I'm sure everybody sort of knows Cat is a nice, easy one. But there have been reports of Caterpillar machinery being used by the Israeli Defense Force in Gaza. And some of those reports are kind of concerns around human rights and different things. And, that was a company where like we had decided to make an investment in Cat, and we had done our due diligence and, were quite happy with where we landed. But throughout, our engagements with I guess the sort of negative perception around that issue has sort of kicked off in 2023, has died down a little bit, but does come up for us. That is something that people kind of ask us about. And, I think the thing that we sort of come back to with an example of that is, so the revenue for Cat, there was about 1% of their revenue would be associated with that particular government and that particular conflict zone. So very, very immaterial if you were just going to, talk about it from a revenue perspective. But it's obviously very material for, people when they think about potential human rights issues. It doesn't really matter about the revenue. But the interesting thing with Cat is that they actually sell to the US government. They have a huge contract with the US government, which is very critically important for them. It's a very strategic contract for them. And they sell all sorts of things that are used all over the world. So they gave us a lot of really positive examples of where machinery are used in, other places in the world for humanitarian aid purposes. But unfortunately, some of that equipment is sold by the US government to the Israeli Defense Force and is being used. And, Cat are in a situation where they understand that exposure. They really don't have any control except to kind of withdraw from that contract. And if they did do that, they would face anti-boycott laws under the US government. So they're in a really, really sort of tricky situation. So that's something for us that was a hard decision. We debated that quite a lot and we looked at all of the facts. And in the end, we as a collective, we at Alphinity were comfortable to invest. But it's something that we sort of monitor very closely. And we recognise that for some of our investors, it is, a bit of a question mark for them. And so we sort of strive to, show them that we have done our due diligence and our, detailed work.
And I know that you've recently released a report. So I think we should wrap up with, I can ask you a lot more questions about this because it's such a topical matter at the moment. But you've just released a report. Tell us very quickly, what are the key highlights from that report?
Yes. So, yes, there is a lot in the report. And, I think this is our fifth responsible investment report, previously called an ESG and sustainability report. But essentially what the report is a sort of presentation of how we manage material issues across our portfolios. That's the sort of most simple way to think about it. And the process we use to structure that is the same that Corporate Australia uses, in that we complete a bottom-up materiality assessment looking at all of our stocks held across the year. We identify the sort of most material topics. So for 2025, it's 30 different material issues wrapped, under 8 priority thematics. And then we present engagement case studies from over 200 engagements. 200 company engagements with over 100 companies. Research projects like this on defence. We've done work on sort of good governance and, enhanced our approach and our assessment around that. We're doing a pilot on First Nations rights and Indigenous peoples using the Dwyer and Illan Business and Investor Initiative. So there's a whole bunch of things in there. And I think for people that are interested in our sustainable funds, we also present our sort of portfolio weighted outcomes across the SDGs using our assessment process that we use internally, and that sort of shows where our funds align most strongly across the SDGs. where some of the negative alignments sit, and some company examples as well. So there's lots and lots of examples and information, and would encourage people to take a look.
Well, we will definitely share a link of it in our show notes because it's out now. And there's plenty of insights there, not just in defense, but you've also looked at climate change and, like you said, First Nations and AI. But once again, Jess, thank you so much for your insights today.
No problem. Thank you very much.
And thank you for listening to The Greener Way. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and share it with one of your colleagues. Until next time, I'm Michelle Baltazar. Thank you for joining us.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.